Hi, everyone. This is Rob Doggett with State University of New York at Geneseo and the International Yeats Society. And I'm here with Adrian Paterson, who is a Yeats expert, lecturer in English at NUI Galway, and among many other things, president of the Modernist Studies Ireland Association. How are you, Adrian? Good to see you.
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me, Rob. It's a great thing to be part of.
It's a great chance to talk about a poem that I really like, although it's such a strange poem, All Souls Night. It's hard to, we were chatting right before this, and I was saying to you, it's hard for me to imagine the tower without it. I think it's such a fitting sort of almost an epilogue. And it was, of course, an epilogue that he used in A Vision, the 1925, when it came out in 1925. It's also this great sort of transition into the Winding Stair, of course. So it feels like this kind of nice transitional poem between the tower and the Winding Stair. But so why did you could have talked about any Yeats poem and you chose this one. Why did you choose All Souls Night?
That's a good question. I mean, I like what you say. It's a transitional poem, even though it was written, 1920 or so. It's between things, isn't it? It's a poem kind of ends. I guess it's an odd poem of ends in some ways, because I think you were saying earlier on before we started this, it was a strange poem, and it's a strange poem to choose, I guess. I think, I mean, for me, it's a kind of classic poem that communicates before it's understood, as T.S. Eliot says about poetry. That when I first came across this, I couldn't have really. I've been looking at it recently as one of the reasons I'm looking at. I've looked at some of the context and tried to figure out what it's telling me. But before that, I couldn't have known, but yet it still had a kind of really, really big impact on me. I mean, probably because it was an Oxford poem, and I was studying Yeats in Oxford at the time, and really didn't know what I was doing. I mean, really, I was an undergraduate, so it made a big impression on me because it started to kind of make sense of what Yeats was doing with ghosts and all these things that I had no belief or feeling for.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my teacher at the time was a woman called Selena Guinness, and she would, we'd do these sessions in her rooms, often in kind of, it was Michaelmas time, so it was kind of as things were getting darker, and we'd kind of, about dusk time, we'd do these poems, and everything would get dark around you. It'd be kind of a magical experience in some way. I mean, Selena's gone on to write kind of really interesting memoirs and things. She's a wonderful writer and a wonderful scholar, but I guess it was that we even did a kind of ritual. I mean, where you get, this poem talks about at a time where the dead might be present, bringing kind of glasses of wine and putting.
Yeah, I was going to say, did you have any muscatel?
Yeah, well, since then I've kind of quite often, as much as I can, made it a ritual on All Souls Night, or at least on Halloween, or sometime. Like, it's a regular thing. It's like a kind of ritual poem that you should do ritually, and you should always bring an extra glass for the ghost, a bit like how you would bring a glass of milk for Santa Claus or something, it needs to sit there while you're doing the poem. So I suppose in some ways, which I should have organized, that we both had glasses of wine.
That's right. That's what we need. I really like what you're saying about communicates before it's understood, because and it's so interesting, right? So a poem that comes out, he wrote it, I guess, probably in 1921, I think, in the autumn, and then uses it later as the epilogue in A Vision, and then uses it again in The Tower in 1928, sort of anticipating where he's going in the Winding Stair. So it's a poem that takes on sort of different resonances when you set it in different contexts. So that's one of the things I'm interested in hearing you talk about, some of these different contexts for the poem. And so you've got some slides. I forgot to ask you, though, I always ask people what they're currently working on. So before we get into the poem, just real quick, what are you up to these days?
Well, some of it has been looking at some of the contexts of this, actually, and looking at kind of music and art in Yeats's poetry. I mean, I've written, I'm co-editing with Tom Walker and Charlie Armstrong a book on Yeats and the arts that will come out from Edinburgh in a couple years' time, or a year or two, probably. So that's taking up some of my time. I mean, I've been writing on other things to do, I suppose, with the voice, to do with sound, to do with kind of sound patterns and things like that. That seems to be what I'm interested in. I had a couple of things on Shaw and Ezra Pound published recently in the Shaw Journal, and I think there was the Edinburgh Companion to Music and Literature, which I had a piece on Pound in. So that's, I mean, those are the kind of things that are preoccupying me, partly because of the kind of medium that we're dealing with right now, which is the strange experience of speaking from far away, which has so many disadvantages, but also has so many advantages, that we can do this amazing thing and talk, as it were, intimately across boundaries of sea and ocean and interface. I mean, that's the kind of thing that Yeats gets interested in, I think, around this time in the 20s and 30s, when radio starts happening, and when you you can imagine communicating beyond the physical world in some way. And the radio kind of emblematizes that for Yeats, as it does, I guess, in this poem when kind of ghosts arrive, you know.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about radio waves too. In sort of Yeats had a lot of different theories about what radio waves were, and sort of a notion of brain waves connecting or movement through the ether, that sort of stuff. Is really interesting.
Well, I guess the context of the poem that's sort of unspoken in the poem is not mentioned really, and is not really even mentioned in A Vision at the time, even when it's published, the first edition of A Vision, where this poem is sort of the end point. I think the epilogue, as you say, is his wife is doing these, no longer so much doing automatic writing, but doing these things called sleeps, where she is sort of semi in a trance and is able to speak the words that the spirits or the teachers give to her, and she can kind of understand the questions that Yeats asks and kind of reply in orally, in other words. And so there's something I think about that weird kind of communication that tells us you don't have to believe in it. I mean, Auden says that kind of thing was embarrassing, but you know, in Yeats's work, the kind of mumbo jumbo of magic, and the poem doesn't ask us to believe in what's happening so much as just reflect on the kind of communication that it involves. And so I'm, you know, as someone that, as I say, doesn't believe in ghosts, to call up someone to mind, to call up someone from memory, is, in Yeats's theology, seems to me just, you know, is a way of producing their ghost, producing their presence in some way. So we can all kind of do that. We, you know, in these strange times when we remember friends, alive or dead, we're somehow conjuring them. We're somehow doing something that connects beyond the physical world. And that's, I think, really, you know, why one of the reasons this poem is interesting kind of now. And it's about, I think it's 100 years old too. Is that right? I think, yeah, I think it was 1920 probably. So it's just over 100 years old, I think, as a poem. So it's amazing that it could speak to us like that.
So that's right. So he's writing it in 1920 is when he was.
I think so. Yeah. Well, it claims so, and you never can be quite sure with his dates.
Right,
I mean, one of the interesting things about it, I suppose, is it's written not far away from the time that 1919 is written, which is kind of put back in time. It's named 1919, but it was probably written in 1920, we think, because of certain things that happened, like, you know, violent events of the Anglo-Irish War, or the Irish War of Independence, as it's generally called now. I mean, and that's a very kind of bitter, brutal kind of poem. At the same time, or a similar time, he's writing this poem, which he says is written in exaltation, you know, which is a kind of a wonderful thing that you might, and it's a private poem. It's, I mean, one of the reasons I like it is that it kind of withholds what it's going to say. Like, it's marvelously subtle and elusive and interesting, but it doesn't tell us finally something. It promises to tell us things and then seems to withhold them in some interesting way, which is frustrating, but also part of the kind of rhetoric, the movement of the poem, not to tell us the marvelous things that it has to say, because, as the poem says, we wouldn't understand. We're living, so we can't possibly understand them.
Oh, that's fascinating. I think, you know, thinking of that context in the 1920, Yeats, you know, writing back and forth to Augusta Gregory during this period, all that's going on in Ireland, and Yeats sort of this desire to be out of, you know, in Oxford, be away from this, and this kind of elusive poem that, yeah, I think that's really important about that poem, promising to say something that it evokes, but doesn't really speak to or say directly, because, as you're saying, we're living through it. So go ahead and share your screen. And I was thinking, maybe if you don't mind reading the poem through. I know it's a bit long. Gosh, what is it, about 10 stanzas, 10 lines each?
Yeah, so it's I should be able to do this. It's 10 stanzas, 10 lines each. So it's got a kind of, you know, force of that kind of, it's very intricate in that way. And you know, it's very, but as I say, it's got to do with the mouth and orality, even though it couldn't be further really from a song. It's really intricate. Now, if I can do this, hang on a minute. I should be able to share. Oh,
okay, good. Go ahead and go with the slideshow as you were before.
The beginning. There you are. Is that right?
Yeah, there we go. That looks good.
And there you can see the poem. So yeah, it's a poem that I guess you have to read out, don't you? Among a minute, because I think some of the point of it is in its sounds, which is one of the ways it communicates before it's understood. I think and you'll hear kind of bell sounds and also sounds of the word end and things like that kind of recur as I read the poem out. I'll do my best. I have. Yeah, I'll see how it goes. Okay, let me get a glass of water. So this is All Souls Night, and as it says in my printing anyway, epilogue to a vision. Midnight has come, and the great Christchurch bell and many a lesser bell sound through the room, and it is All Souls Night, and 2 long glasses brimmed with muscatel bubble upon the table. A ghost may come, for it is a ghost's right. His element is so fine, being sharpened by his death, to drink from the wine breath, while our gross palates drink from the whole wine. I need some mind that, if the cannon sound from every quarter of the world, can stay wound in mind's pondering, as mummies in the mummy cloth are wound, because I have a marvellous thing to say, a certain marvellous thing, none but the living mock, though not for sober ear. It may be all that here should laugh and weep an hour upon the clock. Horton's the first I call. He loved strange thought and knew that sweet extremity of pride that's called platonic love, and that to such a pitch of passion wrought, nothing could bring him when his lady died, anodyne for his love. Words were but wasted breath. One dear hope had he, the inclemency of that or the next winter would be death. 2 thoughts were so mixed up, I could not tell whether of her or God he thought the most, but think that his mind's eye, when upward turned, on one sole image fell, and that a slight, companionable ghost, wild with divinity, had so lit up the whole immense miraculous house the Bible promised us, it seemed a goldfish swimming in a bowl. On Florence Emery I call the next, who, finding the first wrinkles on her face, admired and beautiful, and knowing that the future would be vexed with minished beauty, multiplied commonplace, preferred to teach a school, away from neighbour or friend, among dark skins, and there permit foul years to wear, hidden from eyesight to the unnoticed end. Before that end, much had she ravelled out from a discourse in figurative speech by some learned Indian on the soul's journey, how it is whirled about wherever the orbit of the moon can reach, until it plunge into the sun, and there, free and yet fast, being both chance and choice, forget its broken toys and sink into its own delight at last. And I call up MacGregor from the grave, for in my first hard springtime we were friends, although of late estranged. I thought him half a lunatic, half knave, and told him so, but friendship never ends. And what if mind seemed change, and it seemed change with the mind, when thoughts rise up on bid, ungenerous things that he did, and I grow half contented to be blind? He had much industry at setting out, much boisterous courage, before loneliness had driven him crazed. For meditations upon unknown thought make human intercourse grow less and less. They are neither paid nor praised. But he'd object to the host, the glass because my glass. A ghost lover he was, and may have grown more arrogant, being a ghost. But names are nothing. What matter who it be, so that his elements have grown so fine, the fume of muscatel can give his sharp and pallid ecstasy. No living man can drink from the whole wine. I have mummy truths to tell, whereat the living mock, though not for sober ear, for maybe all that here should laugh and weep an hour upon the clock. Such thought have I, that hold it tight, till meditation master all its parts. Nothing can stay my glance, until that glance run in the world's despite, to where the damned have howled away their hearts, and where the blessed dance. Such thought, that in it bound, I need no other thing, wound in mind's wandering, as mummies in the mummy cloth are wound.
It's lovely. Thank you.
I now have an interruption from my wolfhound here. Let me just pause a second. Hang on, I'll just go and fix him. Hang on.
Sure thing.
Hello, Tom. It's okay. It's okay.
Here we go. Let's start back up. It's good that he let you get to the end of the poem before you start
Well, I
talking.
guess I think it's like he heard a ghost. I mean, it's kind of feeling for the cadence of it. And I mean, I guess that's what the poem's about. It's a strange thing about finding or calling up ghosts Oh, he still thinks he's heard a ghost. Anyway, if you can hear him, he'll calm down in a minute.
Sorry.
He's got something though. There is a presence in this poem, right? There's something that arrives in the poem that is, otherwise not there.
Mm-hmm.
And in that way, it seems to me, that's part of the point of it. It's an Oxford poem, which means it starts with the kind of great Christchurch bell, oh dear, here we go. Here's Christchurch College, and the Tom Tower. This is actually the Tom bell that was, this kind of great bell that begins the poem. And then you have these lesser bells. I think it's all about the lesser bells sounding through the room, and that sound, it seems to be like actually kind of attached itself to the poem. If you look at it, midnight has come, the great Christchurch bell, which is capitalized. Then you have a lesser bell sound,
And it is
and then you
many a
have,
lesser bell, right?
yeah, it should be many. Sorry,
Many, okay,
that's wrong.
that's what
And
I
many a
thought.
lesser bell.
It was like, okay, yeah. Yeah,
No,
many
you're right.
a
You're right. It should be many. Sorry, it's my fault, I think.
lesser.
Anyway, the sound of bells, I think, kind of sounds through the poem in a certain way. You've got bell with a capital, bell with less of a capital, sort of hinted at in All Souls Night, the All of All Souls Night. Muscatel is, of course, the rhyme with bell, so there's part of a bell. Even bubble has a kind of bell noise in it, potentially, an element. And so to kind of, it enacts in sound what it describes, which is kind of one big bell sounding at midnight and lesser bells also sounding through the room, and gradually kind of diminishing as you get sort of towards the interior of the poem and interior of the stanza and interior of the room at which, he's supposedly sitting with this wine.
The sense of a ritual opening then, right? The ringing of the bell as a sort of opening, and then the lesser bells as the start of something. And I like that idea of it sort of fading as we move into the poem.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it partly borrows a bit from, there's a poem by an Anglo-Irish woman called Winifred Letts, who wrote a play or two for the Abbey, and it's called, I think it's called Halloween 1915, and it's actually a poem, an Oxford poem, in which she imagines it's to do with the war, of course, being 1915, and was published, around that time. And Yeats, we know Yeats knew it because he asked Harold Munro, I think, for a copy of this book. And is thinking, I think, of reading the poem out loud to some Oxford societies in around 1919, 1920. So we're pretty sure, I think, that he knows this poem. And it's actually, it's Halloween, it's set in the same time. It imagines the ghosts from the trenches effectively coming back in a kind of companionable way. It's not a scary poem. They kind of come and sit in the chair while the bells sound outside and while the birds sound outside and those other things. So it has a kind of slightly similar movement from the exterior to the interior, which I think is kind of interesting. The Yeats' poem goes further though, because it goes kind of more inside the mind, kind of actually that second stanza starts being about what happens inside the mind. I mean, it's kind of muffling almost with this kind of the end noises of wound in minds pondering as mummies in the mummy cloth, all those long consonants of N's and M's kind of really, if you like, muffle with cloth, the kind of mummy cloth, the sounds of the bells and the sounds of the poem, and that's what it's about. The canon is, it seems to me, yeah, I said it was written around the same time as 1919. I mean, there's a war going on. The First World War is finished, but there's still plenty of wars in Europe, including in Ireland. So that this kind of sense in which you must retire to the interiority of your mind to think about death and what's beyond is something that the poem is takes to heart, I think. Also canon, this is a small point, but canon actually, when the most famous kind of mentioning of bells and sound of that kind is John Donne, isn't it, with his sermons, when he talks about the bells reminding him that no man is an island, all that kind of stuff. Never ask for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. Actually, he talks in that in some of those sermons about the idea that actually bells were really valuable things. They were melted down very often for ordnance and cannons and things like that. They're made of the same metal. And I think he talks about rather kind of rudely about the Turks in Constantinople melting down the bells that they found in churches for cannons. So there's a lot of bell references there, it seems to me, that are kind of unexpected. And as with all this poem, my dog is now saying no, but that's okay.
It's all right.
I mean, it hides what it's got to say. I mean, it really buries the lead. I have a marvelous thing to say, a certain marvelous thing, none but the living mock doesn't tell us what that thing is. It never tells us. It tells us it's the possibility of speech that it's interested in. And so some of these little patterns, I think, the way it works kind of elusively in terms of references and in terms of sound, I think is really how it's telling us things. It doesn't tell us with a kind of great noise like a bell would. It kind of resonates afterwards.
Hmm.
So even in that, like in that second stanza, to laugh and weep an hour upon the clock, I puzzled over that for a long time. I mean, it's kind of such a strange thing to do. To we don't hear the thing itself. We only hear the reaction from a kind of audience that we imagine, you know.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about it, and those are that second stanza, which then we get repeated just in the last stanza. Those are the lines that I tend to remember from the poem, and that sort of anticipation or the effect of what will be told, but we don't know what actually is told. We get a sense that this is how people will react to once he tells this marvelous thing.
Yeah, it's a kind of great rhetorical, I was going to say trick, but that's wrong. I think it's not a trick. There's lots of reasons not to spill the beans in this. I mean, partly because it's magic, and he's, when he was joining magical societies, you had to swear not to tell that what was happening. It's partly because it's a collaboration with his wife, that his wife doesn't want this mentioned. There's lots of reasons not to tell us the things. So it's not a trick. But I mean, in memory of Major Robert Gregory, I think does a slightly similar thing, which is to say, I was going to tell you this about Robert Gregory, but I thought of that late death. What is it? Took all my heart for speech. So he doesn't tell you something, doesn't finish the poem properly. And I think it's Frank Commode says that's a kind of modernist poem. Well, this is another one which says it's, promises something or half promises that there's a thing to tell, but doesn't tell us. So we have to find out what it's saying. I mean, to me, then that's why we have to look at these things like, well, what's laugh and weeping an hour upon the clock? Such an odd thing to say. Laughing and weeping seems to me, I mean, it's of course the two faces of tragedy, or if you like, kind of tragic joy, which Yeats gets from Nietzsche. And Nietzsche does talk about laughing and weeping, and I think it's thus spoke Zarathustra, who talks about kind of a moment in which you should laugh and weep at the same time in one of those dance songs. But even then, you don't do that for an hour exactly. It's sort of precise, as if you can, you laugh and weep. It could be kind of Dionysian kind of excess, but actually it's an hour, which is a long time, but also it finishes, so that starts making me think there's something else going on. The clock the clock you probably know, but the Latin for clock is clocca, which is actually refers back to bells, because clocca is a tongue in Latin. It's the tongue of the bell. So there's something about even mentioning the clock there that is resonant. And I suppose if you imagine from the medieval period onward, when bell sounds are really the thing that give Europe anyway a sense of time for the first time. It's the bells ring out every hour. That kind of hourly chime is a reminder of time. And for Donne and Herbert and all these other poems, or poets I should say, of particularly of Elizabethan Jacobean time, it's a reminder of death. It's a memento mori, isn't it? It rings on a funeral, or it rings every hour to remind us to reflect on something.
I forget where I read this, but someone commenting on mummies in the mummy cloth, too, as for Yeats, possibly representing the relationship between eternity and time. And so the bells are sort of the sound of sort of human time, right? And then the eternal somehow beyond.
Mm-hmm. I think, I don't know if I agree or not. I think it's almost too subtle for me philosophically. What I would say is that, in some ways, I think the mummies in the mummy cloth are literal, which is to say, a lot of one of the things that brings together all the people that are mentioned in the poem, who as readers we can't really know necessarily, is, well, several things bring together, but one is research into Egypt, actually, and an interest in kind of Egyptian magic and Egyptian rituals. They all have that. I mean, Florence Farr writes Egyptian plays. Horton, I think I've got some illustrations of him where he illustrates Egyptian books and things. MacGregor Mathers is actually, writes the rituals or creates the rituals for the Golden Dawn, which are, he says, based on Egyptian mysteries. They're probably not, but the idea is that they come from ancient Egypt, as great Hermes did and all the great kind of occult work does.
I like that. That's interesting then, to really think about it more literally, really, as talking about mummies, talking about Egypt, and
well, yeah, I think so. I mean, well, I have some slides that will help us do that. So maybe I should go on. I don't know. Let's see. What have I got next? Yeah, I should come back to the mummy. I think the mummy's mad. I mean, I don't know. It was a kind of thought experiment, really. What if we take the mummies and the mummy cloth as not just being symbolic of something, which they clearly are,
Right, right.
and not only just a kind of feeling of sound, a kind of acoustic suggestion to the poem. What if we take them literally? And Horton actually is this kind of interesting. I mean, he's an artist, really. But also a visionary. And I think if I have some slides of him, yeah. This is a book of images which he does with. Yeats writes a kind of introduction to his book of images. I haven't got many, but there's a couple of the kind of thing that he's doing. There's kind of wonderful black and white drawings of visions. He says his visions come in full of color and music and sound, and all he can do to translate them is have kind of black and white things. He's Christian, as this kind of implies. I think that it's a church being overwhelmed. I think there. Some of them are obviously, I think, kind of Christian images, but he's also. And so he reverts to Christianity. He's a bit more conservative than Yeats sometimes. He was a bit unsure about kind of some of Yeats's scribblings and dealings with the spirits, actually, and sort of tells Yeats so. He's quite, they're quite open with each other. And so, he's in here in the poem as a kind of antagonist, I think, to what Yeats is doing, which is, after all, is really talking through his wife to the spirit world in some way. But even Horton, does loads of Egyptian pictures. This is one from H. Rider Haggard's book. He illustrates, and so he has kind of these are Egyptian things. You can see the pyramids and I suppose that's Osiris. And so they're all interested, actually, because the connection with the Golden Dawn was interesting. They're all interested in actual Egyptian culture and things, which again it's not really sort of directly talked about in the poem. It's just this odd phrase about mummy truths, and I have mummy truths to tell. So anyway. But that's okay. The final slide for Horton is to say that it's the kind of, they're always, the other thing that in common with it, they're all interested in death. I should have said it that way at the first way. They're all dead and they're all interested in death. They're interested in the worlds beyond. And so this is one of his illustrations too. It's clearly kind of gates into the next world. Those are the kind of things that they're all, people in the poem mentioned, are interested in. And so that, I think, I could come back to, let's see, come back to the, sorry, that's annoying. Come back to the stanza about Horton, but I think that's part of what he's talking about here is, he's died and he's also imagining communing with his chaste lover. And to do that with the kind of experience of a saint, he's kind of wild with divinity, and it becomes miraculous, this process of community. As well as, I think the poem somewhat subtly criticizes the idea that Platonic love is such a great idea. And actually, the poem is partly about consummation in some ways. All these researchers, the other thing that they share is they're interested in various kinds of celibacy. They enact either their marriage as a blanc in the French phrase, or Horton does Platonic love. Farr was anything but celibate, but retires in a sense to Sri Lanka, to leaving her youthful loves behind and leaving her friends behind. And so that's part of what the poem is interested in. But anyway, it's clearly a divine experience that you might get. Someone wild with divinity might get something close to this. Maybe the thing to pick up there would be, again, that phrase, two thoughts were so mixed up I could not tell. I mean, again, it's a poem I could not tell. It's a poem about not telling. There's a kind of pun on tells there. I do really think of it as a kind of metaphysical poem in that way, like something like Donne or Herbert or something,
I was thinking that too. And the one of the things that strikes me is looking at the end of that stanza, wild with divinity, it so lit up the whole immense miraculous house the Bible promised us. It seemed a goldfish swimming in a bowl. This, in looking at the images, what's really striking to me, one of the things that strikes me in the images is the juxtaposition of scale, and those like tiny little pyramids against that sort of immensity. And here we have that same kind of play at the end of that stanza with immensity, right? The sort of heavens and then the goldfish bowl image.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I never thought of it like that. You're right. I suppose that's, I guess for Horton and for Yeats, that would have a really serious connotation about the microcosm and the macrocosm. If you're kind of into esoteric research, that's sort of the basic correspondence, is that small things, meaning which can be kind of symbols or a glass of wine or whatever it is, also mean really large things. They're a kind of image of the whole. And things below are as things above, as the kind of Hermetic tablet says. So anything in this world mirrors potentially the other world, and the other world mirrors our world. It's not so different. So that's very interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought of it like that. You're
Yeah,
right. The pyramid
what's
is
interesting to me in the
so
way
small.
what you're talking about too is, for me, those scale shifts often produce a kind of evocation of something that is not, directly stated or containable. Even though we get the sense of like the whole universe contained in the goldfish bowl, the force of that is like evoking, well, something else, something beyond some mass that the poem is pointing towards, but doesn't name that unspoken immensity.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, in some ways, I mean, even the kind of stanza form of 10 lines and then the kind of repetition, it kind of comes back. It's kind of circular. In some way, I was unhappy with the idea that it's a circular poem. It's kind of almost spherical or something. It contains something. It's actually kind of got depth to it,
Mhm.
and it's kind of like an echoing chamber that sometimes is open and sometimes is muffled. Maybe if you want a bit more like a wine glass or something open like that. But I think. Yeah, but potentially it's a world within a world. And if you look at all those esoteric books from, Robert Flood or whoever it is, they often have these kind of diagrams of how, for instance, the human body represents the heavens or whatever it is, that the small thing and the large thing kind of, they're wheels within wheels or circles or spheres within spheres. That's part of the idea, which, is sort of goes back to even the music of the spheres, the connection of everything with everything else is in those kind of symbols. I mean, maybe to mention what Florence Farr is interested in. Well, actually, this I think it's the fifth stanza. In some way, where it brings up Florence Farr, and we were talking about she actually Florence Farr as opposed to Florence Emery. I guess that's to make the rhyme or to make the scansion work, but does obscure who she is. She was a kind of interesting person. I think this is the most unsuccessful stanza, if I'm honest. It's even that minished beauty multiplied commonplace. It's kind of thrusting together. It's trying to reduce the number of syllables in the line for some reason that really feels a bit awkward. And the way it's describing her life, it's as if she's kind of vain or something, and it has to disappear. And I think that's probably unfair to her. I mean, she was, I think, very beautiful, but that's not really the question. That it's not really the reason she goes to Sri Lanka and goes to teach school, I think. So I think the poem is unfair. Well, it may be unfair on
Just
everybody.
again, for people who don't know a ton about her, she was in she played in the Countess Kathleen, right?
That's right. Yeah.
And and the
She's
sultry, yeah.
she sings and chants and is for 10 years or longer, probably 15 years, is involved with Yeats in a kind of verse chanting escapade,
I think
which
escapade is the
finally,
right word.
well, I mean, I think they took it really seriously, and they did performances in London and all the university towns. And Ron Shood's book kind of gives a kind of account of this. But finally, I won't say it's finally a failure, but finally she leaves, and Yeats is, I think, bitter about that actually. That in 1911 or thereabouts, she decides she's going to go around the other side of the world, which is Ceylon or Sri Lanka. And Yeats, I think, is hurt by this actually in some way, because it means that this collaboration that he's worked so hard on can no longer continue. And so there's something that bitterness, I think, creeps in the poem actually. I mean, she was doing all sorts of other things at the time. She was an actress. She knew, in fact, had an affair with George Bernard Shaw, and wrote Egyptian plays. She's another Egyptian. She writes these Egyptian plays with Olivia Shakespeare. She writes political tracts. She's a kind of great feminist and a really interesting person. But some of that disappears, I think, in the poem. So, but maybe one could say that the thing that does recover is actually her. She corresponds with Yeats. The others tend to fall out with Yeats, but she keeps corresponding with Yeats while she's in India, or while she's in Sri Lanka, I should say. And what they talk about actually is most of the time is poetry, like the sound of the local poetry, even vowel sounds and things, and how to translate that into English. They talk about music and the musical instruments that she finds, including a vina. Like Yeats says, "Oh, do you miss the psaltery?" And she says, "Well, I'm playing on a vina." Which is a kind of a kind of lute-like instrument that this, which has a kind of has even a gourd. It has a kind of resonant chamber on it. That's the kind of weird round thing on the near the neck of the instrument. But they correspond. She does drawings of these things, and so they're corresponding about sound and music, and also death and what happens after death. And the poem, I think, at least pays tribute to that kind of continuation of her research. I mean, this is not a retirement actually. It's for her, it's a kind of spiritual journey. And then when the poem talks about, I think it's the soul's journey, isn't it?
Mhm.
That she's raveled out some discourse on the soul's journey. That's what it's talking about, is her kind of interest in, well, finding out from what the local culture is, both Hindu and Buddhist and these other things, and kind of applying that to the end of her life. The poem talks about ends here a lot, the unnoticed end and the end of things.
Mhm.
She talks about making a brave end to her life, and at some point she gets cancer and probably knows she's dying. Yeats doesn't quite understand, I think, that she's dying, but she knows. And so there is in some sense in which she's meeting her end in an important way. I think she says in a letter, she says something about being true of voice, which is a kind of reference to an Egyptian ritual, which I could go into, but maybe shouldn't. But anyway, all it means is that at the end of your life, you arrive before Osiris. I don't know if I have a picture of it, but yeah, your heart gets weighed and you have to justify yourself before Osiris. It's a great thing. This, if you want, you can go look at the video. The Met video is great about it. But you stand before Osiris and your heart is taken out. It's weighed with a feather, and then you have to say, I have not committed all these sins that you probably have. You have to kind of lie, I think. And then you are judged to be either damned and thrown away forever, or you can live with the gods because you are justified, or true of voice is the literal translation. So Florence Farr writes this to Yeats in one of her last letters to him. And remember, knowing that he will remember back in the 90s their researches. So there's something about vocal sound mattering to how this poem works, I think, as well as all this other stuff. I mean, it's kind of interesting. But I mean, again, I guess the soul in its last moments ends free and yet fast, I think, being both chance and choice, and forget its broken toys, sink into its own delight at last. I mean, it's something, both joyous and measured about that,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's like how can we know the dancer from the dance? There's a kind of freedom, but a kind of control to the end of our existence in the soul. And that's what, it's kind of obscure, but that's what Farr and Yeats are corresponding about at the end of her life.
And of course, we see too Yeats, the visionary system, sort of all lurking in that as well. That chance and choice comes up, of course, as phase 15, references to phase 15, and all that sort of thing later on, as he elaborates it in a vision.
Yeah, you're right. It's again, it's hinting at that. I mean, I think the poem's first published in 921, when a vision doesn't exist yet as a book. So it's telling us something about this system that even Yeats doesn't yet understand.
Yeah,
I think he's still elaborating it. Yeah. So that's another reason why it can't tell us the answer, because Yeats just takes several years and indeed a whole another edition before even then an imperfect version of what he thinks is the answer of the soul's journey comes out. So anyway.
So now we got MacGregor.
Well, MacGregor's the weirdest one of all of them. Right. I mean, he's a strange one. They have an argument about the Golden Dawn, which I don't need to go into. It's kind of about control, really. Mm-hmm. He's from Paris trying to control what happens in London, and Florence Farr and Yeats and others have different views about how it should work.
About forging, wasn't he involved with forging, or they were accused of forging documents?
Yeah, it's partly where the authority for the teachings of the Golden Dawn come from, I think. Right? It's to do with, which is a sort of documents that may or may not have emerged from the masters, these kind of people. And Mathers, when the others die off, Mathers finally says, well, I'm the one that knows about the doctrine. And Yeats and he, I mean, it all sounds silly, but I mean, I think Yeats takes more from someone like MacGregor Mathers than he does even from Oscar Wilde or William Morris or someone like that. Like he idolizes MacGregor for quite a long time. He calls him a fallen idol once this kind of argument comes out, and he's already got a bit embarrassed by the fact MacGregor really believes in everything he says. MacGregor's not his name. MacGregor is a made up Celtic addition for a man that's actually called Samuel Liddell Mathers. That's his real name. But Yeats gives him the credit of naming himself, and again calling up MacGregor from the grave. That's exactly the sort of thing MacGregor would have tried to do in all these rituals. So it's kind of rude, I think. MacGregor doesn't want to come and see Yeats at all. Mm-hmm. Doesn't want to be in his house, and Yeats admits this. He'll object to the host, the glass because my glass. It's the kind of antagonism is fun, but also I think the friendship which matters. And again, if you're interested, you know, it's an interest in what he looks like. This is where they kept meeting in the British Museum reading room, right? This is a great hub of learning and Egyptology, and Farr and Horton and McGregor Mathers, and everyone turns up here all the time. And you know, Yeats does his researches there, does his reading there, of course, because it has just about every book. It's a copyright library, has just about every book published in Britain and Ireland, certainly, because that's the rule, but also across the empire, you know. So it's a kind of center of learning, but also is in the British Museum, which is, of course, even now you come to London, everyone goes to see, what do they go see? They go see the mummies in the British Museum. Of course, that's what you'll see. Like, you know, if you go now, these rooms are crowded. Well, they're not kind of right now, I suppose. No, we can't go in. But everyone comes to see the mummies because this fascination of what you do with these dead bodies and wrapping them up, and how they might be, of course, they did this in order to reincarnate in some way, or to revive the bodies. That's why they were preserved in this way. And Farr and Mathers and all these people write about this and think about what this means as a kind of, you know, as a process. Anyway, I mean, Mathers himself this is a picture of Mathers and his wife. They're kind of wonderful and crazy, but we're you know, creating these rituals. Finally, they create Egyptian rituals for in a theater in Paris. I don't have a picture of that. Yeah, this is them being, you know, doing the Isis ritual.
Oh, that's great.
Which of course is mad, but actually is not as well. It's got like music, and I mean, Moyna Bergson Mathers was really very musical. Her father was a composer, and she does costumes and artwork. She's a designer. Mathers had a kind of great voice. Yeats talked about, well, I may have fallen out with him, but he had this kind of erect body with a kind of military mien, and he kept kind of claiming to have military expertise, but also this wonderful voice. So when they were doing the rituals that, you know, Yeats would do and Farr would do, they would go to the vault, which is the kind of Rosicrucian 7-sided tomb, or chamber or temple or something, and do all these rituals, and that's what happened in the Golden Dawn. So all that is kind of underneath the poem's operation, seems to me. All that kind of intercourse, I think is the word used, human intercourse. But when you stop speaking to each other, when you stop understanding each other that way, then you might go mad, because this research is, you know, esoteric, to say, and mad, possibly. Should we do the last couple of stanzas, Rob? Do you think? It seems like I don't want to take too long. So I love this part. So having named all these people that we don't know, like if you haven't heard of any of these people, that's fine. Like, you're not supposed to. No one reading this poem for the first time could have heard of them. So I'm a bit doubtful about bringing up these contexts in a way, because the reader of the poem can't kind of follow all that. And in a way, the poem admits that. It dismisses all these names. You know, he calls them all up and makes them present in the room that he's dealing with, whether they want to be there or not, as ghosts, and then he dismisses them. I mean, it's a wonderful thing to do. Arrogant, I think, as well. I mean, he says Mathers is arrogant, but you know, I think it's a kind of powerful dismissal to say what doesn't matter. But I guess that it's also humble in the sense that he's dismissing anyone. You know, that actually we're all dying, in a sense. We're all going to die. And so our names may or may not be preserved. Like Ozymandias, they may be, you know, the idea is we're going to be preserved, but we probably won't be. And while we're living, we come back to this idea, we still can't understand the truth, really, or not properly. And that seems to me kind of, I don't know, kind of powerful.
Yeah.
Partly because the people really, a lot of the important people in the poem aren't named because they're not dead. So his wife George and Mina Mathers are these, you know, collaborators in all these esoteric work are not named. You know, it's very strange. Anyway, this phrase, "I have mummy truths to tell." Again, he's sort of not telling us. And there's a whole series of nothings and negatives of various kinds. No living man, nothing can stay my glance in this last thing, which is, you'd think would be kind of a nullity. It's kind of, you know, getting rid of all that's gone before and leaving us in nothingness. And potentially, I suppose it does. But I think there's another movement here that's really allows something to survive, even if it's only in the interior mind in some way. You know, this thought can outlive even bodily death in some way. You know, it's communicated by the dead, it's passed on through the living, but also kind of potentially outlives all of us. You know,
Hmm.
and so it doesn't seem to me then a kind of negative poem at all. I need no other thing is what it finally comes down to. It's the only thing you need is this kind of thought finally. So all the paraphernalia, or even those kind of Egyptian costumes, or all that, you don't actually need. You know, you don't need any of that. You just need thought and well, hearing, I suppose, because you have to hear this sort of wisdom, I think,
Hmm.
which comes back to his wife, who's, I don't know, in these sleeps, kind of communicating it. That there's a kind of, if we listen to what happens, then we can get close to it.
I think it's really interesting. I was reading, for some stupid reason, I've been reading some Kierkegaard. I was reading the three godly discourses, the lilies of the field one, and he talks about prayer as listening. And I, as you're talking, that's really interesting, the way that it connects up with what you're talking about at the outset, about the way that this poem is about sound and um, sort of listening for something that we don't know what it is. He doesn't tell us what exactly that thing will be, but it's that ongoing sort of listening, I think, that
Mm-hmm.
that has this kind of prayerful quality to it. Although of course it's not like Kierkegaard here. This is more of this kind of occult of seeking.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I think, I mean, you know, I think Samuel Beckett says poetry is prayer. So, you know, even people you don't think are going to connect the two things, but I think that's close to it is an oddly, although it's very occult and esoteric, it has a kind of Christian symbolism to it, with the bells, after a while, you know,
Mhm.
are Christian things. I think, well, there's a moment in the script actually that is perhaps worth mentioning. I can't remember exactly when it is, but it's you know, October or something, 1920. And in one of these sleeps, his wife George is you know, in a trance and communicating, and everything stops and everyone stops to listen.
Huh.
And even the kind of communicators, the spirits, such as they are, whether they're the imagination of both Yeats and his wife, or whoever they are, they say stop for a minute and we need to listen. And what they listen to is several things. One time they listen to a bird song, a kind of owl hooting, and the other time they listen to a midnight chiming on the clock. So that's, you know, and they say something like, sounds like that give great pleasure to us. So there's this weird way that even the dead are kind of conjoined with the living in a process of listening to the sound of midnight bells.
That's interesting. Can I ask? I wanted to ask you one other thing here about that last stanza. The word glance that gets repeated, and of course it reminds us, of the brightening glance that we mentioned
Mm.
earlier in among school children. But I wonder why glance is important here, as opposed to, say, a gaze or a stare. Or there's a sense of the glance as having a different relationship with the object. That's maybe, and well, what do you think of that?
I think that's very interesting. My view of that would be that, again, you can, in the same way that Horton's, you know, pictures are only black and white, his visions were kind of color and music and everything like that. And what he gets is black and white images that sometimes Yeats criticizes. I mean, Yeats agrees to write the introduction to his book, but actually criticizes them. In the same way, you can only glance at the things in the next world. I mean, we
Mhm.
can't look at them full in the face until potentially we die. And even then, it's not certain. So I think that's part of it.
And the opposite of,
Um,
right, of a kind of rational, that sort of steady observational sort
yeah,
of scrutiny, right? That this is a different sort of relationship with truth or permanence, or whatever that is in the beyond, that we can only see it kind of aslant.
well, I mean, maybe I'm obsessed with sound at the moment, but the way I partly read it also is because like so many words in this poem, it repeats itself, right? So nothing can stay my glance until that glance run in the world's despite. You could easily not do that. There's a moment early in his life when he's listening to Wilde read out a long sentence, or in one of his prose books, I think, and Wilde changes the word, uses the word sad and uses the word melancholy, And Yeats asked him, why do you change the word? Why don't you just use sad twice? You know, why not just stay the same? And Wilde says, oh, it sounds better to do that. But Yeats is interested in using the same words, repeating things. And this poem is all about that kind of repeat. So nothing can stay my glance until that glance running the world's despite. And of course it rhymes with dance. That's part of the idea of the two. But like the word ghost, or like the word end, or like the word tell, or death and breath, all these words are repeated, sometimes many times in the poem. And again, you know, this ending is all repeating things, almost repeating. So bound, wound in minds, well, originally it's pondering and now it's wandering. There's mummies in the mummy cloth are wound. I mean, there's a kind of sense in which, you know, again, it's a kind of circularity, but maybe a musical kind of repeat, or even a kind of, you know, return. So part of these, that's part of why I think when I first looked at this poem and really knew nothing of the context, it seemed to be kind of brave to do that, to kind of have a poem that repeats itself so much, just doesn't change the words. Like it doesn't do the elegant variation that some people are taught to do at school. It actually repeats itself and goes back on itself. And that's part of the winding and part of the operation of the thing. So that's part of what I think it's done to do. I'm not sure if that really explains what my meaning. But
yeah, no, I think that's right. It's such a one last thing I wanted to ask you about is sort of something you were talking about at the outset. Thinking about this poem as a poem about relationships, and these specific people are important, but as you said, we don't. A lot of Yeats's readers at the time wouldn't have known who the heck these people were, and in a lot of ways, we don't need all the context about these people. It's sort of an evocation of friends who've died and our complicated memories of them, and that this kind of ghostly ritual as in some ways about being, in some ways about something that's really ordinary, the ways in which we, in moments, we experience the echoes of friendships and of those conflicting feelings we have towards the people.
That's interesting. Yeah, I like the sense of ordinariness, because it's such an esoteric, strange poem that one can forget that there are a lot of things in it, actually. I mean, he says, I need no other thing, but in the poem, he has wine glasses and, wine and toys and all these little things. The stuff, if you like, of everyday life appears in the poem quite a lot. And that's even a goldfish. I mean, the stuff domestic stuff that you end up in, that is usually just in your room, is actually part of he would call it phantasmagoria of the poem, part of the things, part of the paraphernalia. And that, I think, is interesting, that there is a kind of ordinariness to this. I mean, as you say, it's a very odd elegy, because it's sort of rude about some of the people, and it's not just saying how wonderful they were, it says all sorts of other things about how annoying they were. And so there's a kind of ordinariness to that, and a kind of honesty to that, perhaps, that most elegies don't have. When someone dies is the time to say all these wonderful things about them. Don't speak ill of the dead, and that old thing. Well, this allows us to speak in a kind of ordinary, personal way, a human way of the dead, and admit also that they wouldn't like it, that they would disagree, and that all these kind of, if you like, magical researchers are trying to find out what happens in the end. Well, Yeats' view is different from a lot. They disagree about this, and usually sometimes amicably, sometimes not. Well, finally they know, and he doesn't, because they've already died, so they must surely know really what's happened.
It's so different from In Memory of Major Robert Gregory.
Yeah, I guess he has to write that after several goes, and as a kind of stately tribute,
kind of elegy. And I like that idea of this kind of ordinariness about it. It's really helped, as you talked about this, it's helped me think about this poem in a lot of different ways. I had always tended to think about it in terms of a vision, because a vision, even though it's written before a vision, it just has that feeling of a vision to it, and restoring it to this kind of these different contexts, I think, really changes the poem.
I don't know. I was going to have a slide of a vision. I don't know if I've lost it, maybe, but I don't. But okay. To me, this is a picture of W.B. Yeats's wife, called Mrs. W.B. Yeats. This is George Hyde Lees. It was a kind of, with all her kind of symbolism and her kind of, her ability, which is, she's also, this poem is a tribute to her, as so many of this time are, right? but actually it seems to be a bit more like this, which is, I hate the fact it's got Alami on it, but it's more kind of intimate picture of the two of them.
Mhm.
It's the only version of this picture I could find, unfortunately. But anyway, it's about a kind of closeness, intimacy, even a kind of sexuality, potentially, that kind of ecstasy that the poem just hints at, and a domesticity, finally, like, an ordinariness of living together, which Yeats finally hasn't done with anyone before, and is now doing for the first time, really, as in his 50s.
Mhm.
So that, I think, has something interesting to say about, well, that's a change in Yeats's life that he's kind of drawing on when he's writing about this poem. It's finally about being in Oxford and studying there, but also just existing with an intimate relationship with a woman for the first time.
Yeah.
And so that has to be part of it. So it's not about George Yates. Can't mention George Yates, but it's not so much about her kind of wonderful skills as a kind of medium or interpreter, but more about intimacy in that way, which is why it mentions his friends. After all, Yeats really liked these people. I mean, he knew them well, and these are, I don't know, these are people who you must, every time you think of them, you call them to mind. They're gone, but you can call them to mind, and then they're companionable. I mean, it is a companionable poem in that way. The ghost is companionable, and ghosts should be companionable. They're not things to be terrified of, even though this is Halloween, and you might have all sorts of scary happenings.
That's great. Can you maybe go back to our?
I'll stop sharing. There's quite enough pictures, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that I really enjoyed that, Adrian. Do you have anything you want to conclude on? Or we I think we covered an awful lot
No,
on there.
no. Only if you're looking at the poem, there are loads more kind of sound patterns that I think do tells. Ezra Pound had this joke about Yeats that he was actually, his name should be William Tell, because he can never keep secrets. Like, he loved secrets, but would always tell them to people, and so even the rituals of the Golden Dawn, he's always hinting at in various fictions and things like that. So I think the poem is about the kind of ways of hinting at things you can't say in sound. And so if I were to go back and look at the poem again, probably I might, it seems to me you can find all sorts of interesting things in the sound patterns and the way it works. And that is deliberate. It doesn't seem to me an accidental process. That's the sort of thing he's discussing with Farr, what sound does in poetry. And she finally says, the only thing that's worth knowing about a poet is what they sound like, which is, in different languages. And so Yeats's language skills were terrible, but in English, he can try and construct something that has lots of sounds, lots of tells, if you like, in that kind of, that poem. So if I were to look at this again, or someone else was, you might come up with different things, different words that do something interesting. But I certainly think it's worth the endeavor. You don't have to take any of the magic parts seriously, but the at all. And sometimes I don't. But the operation of a magical spell is the sound that is the thing that matters as much as the meaning. And this poem does that really wonderfully, I think.
Well, that was, I enjoyed that so much, talking with you about the poem. That was fantastic. Thanks so much, Adrian.
Well, thanks so much for having me. And this is Rocket the dog who says hello, and has chased away the ghost, thankfully, for today. That's really
all right.
helpful.
All right.
Take care.